Good morning. You're going to leave your Bibles open there to Matthew chapter 10, the passage that Xander read for us just a few moments ago. I will meet you there in just one moment. We talk about where he leads, I'll follow. And there are two questions as we deal with the topic of discipleship this morning that are more important than any others when it comes to talking about discipleship. Particularly the fact that as you look at what Paul said, or Saul of Tarsus, as he met Jesus upon the road to Damascus. You remember that there was a bright light shone from heaven, and Saul of Tarsus said, "Who are you, Lord?" And when Jesus introduced himself and said, "I'm Jesus of Nazareth, whom you're persecuting. It's hard for you to kick against the goads." Saul then asked a second question that again is at the heart of discipleship. "Who are you, Lord? But what would you have me to do?" You really want to be a disciple of Jesus, you've got to answer and deal with and wrestle with those two questions. Who are you, Lord? And what would you have me to do? That's what's at the heart of discipleship. I didn't think that I was going to ever have to introduce a sermon like this, but the two questions of who are you and what would you have me do happened in a very real sense this past week. On Friday, about lunchtime, I started getting phone calls. "Andy, I got this email from you, and it says that it's from the minister Andy Baker, and I got this email from you, and as I'm looking at this, you're asking me to send you gift cards." Well, let me say this. You can look with a healthy skepticism at any email I send you. Please do that. Okay? It may have my picture attached like this email address did. It may have something like Min Andy Baker on it at Gmail. It sounds a whole lot like me. But I appreciate the ones who called and said, "Hey, I got this from you. Is this really you?" I understand that sometimes we take for granted that this is a genuine correspondence from a genuine person. But it's okay to go back, and especially with man, to be able to say, "Hang on just a second, did you really send this? Did you really ask me to do this?" Not that I'm saying that anybody here is my disciple, but I appreciate the trust and I appreciate the healthy skepticism that's been offered for those things, and realize that again, if you get, and this is just a broad principle, folks, if you get any kind of correspondence, whether that be a phone call, whether that be a video chat, whether that be an email, whether that be anything else, a text message, and somebody is asking you to go and buy them gift cards, there ought to be red flags going off in your head to say, this is probably a scam and I need to evaluate this. If it's from a person that you think that you know, you look at it and you say, "Hang on just a second, I need to contact this person and find out if this is really who this is, and if really this is what this person wants me to do." At the heart of following Jesus, there's a lot of counterfeit disciples. And there's a lot of counterfeit things that are being proposed in the name of Jesus, that Jesus either, it's out of line of his character, or it's out of line of his teaching. Do you really know what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, a follower, a pupil, an understudy? Do you really know Jesus? We can know all of the commands from A to Z, from Matthew all the way through Revelation, everything that Jesus talks about, all from forwards and backwards, and we can know all of those things, and yet at the same time we can be woefully ignorant of the character, of the ways, of the means, of the person of Jesus. When we talk about discipleship, people in the New Testament times knew what it meant to be a disciple. In fact, as you look, there were disciples of John the Baptizer. There were disciples of the Pharisees. The people on one occasion were talking to Jesus and arguing Jesus in some respect in John chapter 9, and they said, or they're talking to this blind man who is made well, and they're talking to him say, "Well, we're Moses' disciples." They knew what it was like to be a follower, to know the person and the character of the people that they were following. But as we look at see Jesus and his discipleship, there's a number of things that are vastly different with the way that he offered to have people come and follow him versus the people of that day. Here are just a few as we get started this morning. The way that Jesus approached discipleship was vastly different. Number one, because he was one who called and chose his disciples. Often you would find Jesus going and handpicking the people that he knew would be followers of his. Jesus would say in John chapter 15 that I chose you. You didn't choose me, so that I could choose you, that you could go and you could bear fruit. You see, in the first century discipleship, it was often the student that chose the teacher. And again, please understand that happened, and yet at the same time, 17 times in 4 gospel accounts, Jesus says, follow me. 17 times. Jesus often called and chose his disciples. When you look at the contrast of the way that Jesus chose disciples or the way that people became disciples of Jesus, it was more than just a student-teacher relationship. With a pupil, with an understudy, with somebody who would come and sit at the feet of a teacher and want to study them and study their ways, the way that Jesus and his disciples related to one another was vastly different than most teacher-student relationships. In fact, in John chapter 13, verse 1, it said Jesus knew that his hour had come, and he had loved those who he chose to the end. And then he would give this statement later on in the same chapter to say, by this will all men know that you're my disciples if you have love for one another. There's a relationship that Jesus has with his disciples, that he loves them and they love him more than a teacher-student relationship. There's a vastly different way that Jesus relates to his disciples in the fact that there was a different goal and a different result than particularly rabbinic Judaism of that day. Remember, Paul would talk about his credentials in Philippians chapter 3 and other places, and the fact that he was a Hebrew of Hebrews. In fact, he sat down and he studied at the feet of a rabbi named Gamaliel. He started talking about the big names. Gamaliel, Shimei, Hillel. Paul sat down at the feet of Gamaliel, and he knew he was going to be somebody great if he had stayed on that course. With Jesus and his disciples, Jesus would measure greatness in a vastly different way. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. You remember the disciples on one occasion came to him and said, Teacher, who's the greatest? Which one of us, James and John, came and said, let us sit on one on the right hand and one on your left hand? Jesus, on those arguments about greatness, would talk about him who's least. He came and set a child in their midst to let them know that the way that my disciples are going to relate to me and the way that I'm going to relate to my disciples, and if you're really going to measure true greatness, it's all in humility. It's all in how much you can lower yourself and become a servant of all, as Jesus would say. There's a different goal, different result. Jesus called his disciples particularly so that he could send them, so that they could go and they could be his emissaries. Matthew 28, verse 18 and 19, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all things, whatever I've commanded you. Matthew 28, verse 19. It wasn't just an end of the relationship where you come and you sit at the feet of a teacher, but discipleship is all about following, and it's all about going out and making disciples. Consider also the way that Jesus related to his disciples. Is Jesus wanted his teaching to be a blessing to others or to his pupils and not a burden? It stands in stark contrast to what you find from the Pharisees, from the scribes, from the lawyers of that day in Matthew 23 and verse 4, where it says, they bind heavy burdens on men which are hard to bear, and they are not going to move them even with their little finger. They're going to take these teachings and they're going to lay them on their students, but they're not going to take those teachings on themselves. Jesus offers what we call the great invitation. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly of heart. Do you really know Jesus? Do you really know what Jesus wants you to do? Those two questions are imperative when we talk about discipleship. Because true discipleship is this. It's about living close to Jesus. Living close to Jesus. Staying near to him and near to his heart. It's about listening to his words and his ways. Not only studying the thus saith the Lord aspect of what he wants us to do and what he wants us to be, but also looking at his character and how he related to people and how he talked to people. And you want to know his words, but you also want to know his ways. Being a disciple of Jesus is all about what you give up for his sake. Sacrificing. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. Being a disciple of Jesus is about reflecting his love and his glory to others. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Matthew 5, verse 16. That's what it's about, being a disciple. Who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? It's possible, brothers and sisters, please don't misunderstand. It is possible to follow Jesus and yet never really be a disciple of his. It's possible to listen to him and never really apply what he's told us in one of these 4 ways. So the question becomes, what really are hallmarks of discipleship? What things should we look for and what ways should we behave because we're disciples of Jesus? The passage that Xander read for us is going to help us. There are 6 hallmarks of discipleship. What does it really mean to say, who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? What's going to really cause me and to look at myself and say, I just want to be a disciple of Jesus and nothing else. I want to know who he is, and I want to know what he wants me to do. There are 6 of them in Matthew 10, verses 24 through 42. Let's talk about them briefly this morning. Hallmark number 1. A disciple learns his master. A disciple learns his master. And he would start off with a verse that we're semi-familiar with. This is Matthew's account. Luke's is a little bit different, and yet at the same time, Luke 6, verse 40, what we've been teaching to our kids during Kids Sing, is the same idea and the same scope. And notice that Jesus starts off with 3 different comparisons here in this verse. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor is a servant above his master. It's enough that the disciple is going to become like his teacher and the servant is going to become like his master. And he would go on to say, if they call the master of the house Beelzebul, that's a reference to Satan. And in fact, it's often translated in reference to Satan as Lord of the Flies or Lord of Corruption. Both of those fit. And he says, if they're going to call me Beelzebul, the rulers of the demons, how much more those who are in my house? How much more those who are in my house? And he does these things by giving the negative first. A disciple's not above his teacher. A servant's not above his master. We submit and we remember, folks, we're never going to be above Jesus. I want to be wise like Jesus. I want to have relationships like Jesus. I want to have an influence like Jesus. But we're going to end up being like Jesus, and if Jesus was treated in a certain way, so we can expect that if we really want to know Christ, we're going to be treated in that exact same way. Consider this. I like visuals, and this graph seemed to help me as I began to reason through this and think about this passage. If this line up here at the top represents Jesus, the master, the teacher, the master of the house, as I become a disciple of his and I begin to grow, there is an aspect of learning the master where I may be jumping off and saying, all right, I'm going to really exponentially grow as I grow over time. But what's going to happen is the more I study Jesus and the more I learn Jesus, you're going to find that line begins to parallel so that I am like Jesus, so that I am like the teacher, so I am like the master. So that I'm identified with the master's house. When people look and see me, hopefully they're going to say, I see a disciple of Jesus. I see Christ in you, the hope of glory. I see when Christ, who is our life, appears, then you'll also appear with him in glory. Colossians chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. The aim, the goal, the scope of my life is to learn him so much that people say, you're like your teacher. You're like your master. You're obviously a member of his house. A disciple's going to learn his master. Friends, we can't ever learn our Master if we're going to spend time apart from His Word. One of the scriptures we read, John 8, verses 31 and 32, Jesus said to those Jews who believed in Him, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And I say to the Arnold congregation, our elders see being disciples and spending time in the Word is important to us, and really wanting to know Jesus and wanting to know who He is and what He wants us to do. After our worship, we have an opportunity to gather together as God's people and study His Word. And you look and you wonder why there's such a disparity sometimes between the worship attendance numbers and the Bible class numbers. Or even then, the spiritual growth numbers after that. Are we really not interested in spiritually growing? Are we really not interested in growing like Jesus? Those are questions I have to ask of myself. Who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? Where do you suppose Jesus would be? Those are questions we have to ask. Is He really my teacher? Is He really my master? Am I really a part of His household? When we talk about fellowship opportunities, where we gather together as His people, and enjoy being Christians together and enjoy the bond of what He's created us to do and what He's created us to be, I've got to ask myself, am I really a disciple if I want to choose to be somewhere else in fellowship with something else? I know things happen. I know sometimes occasions, circumstances come up, but folks, if that's a habitual practice of life, can we really say that I really want to know Jesus? Who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? Hallmark number 2. Disciple's not afraid of the world. A disciple isn't afraid of the world. 3 times in 6 verses, do not fear. Something like that is occurring there in verse 26, 28, and verse 31. And there are a couple of reasons why he talks about us not being afraid. 3 times, 6 verses, do not fear. Number 1, because God is going to set the record straight. Notice what he says in verse 26, "Therefore do not fear them, for there will be nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden which will be not be known. Whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light. Whatever you hear in the ear, preach on the housetops." There's going to come a time when everything is going to be revealed. When sometimes, brothers and sisters, you may be reviled and you may be persecuted for Christ's sake. And the world may treat you horribly. One of the best things you can do is look at the character of Jesus. What did He do? Did Jesus immediately stand up and say, "Well, hang on, that's not right," and vindicate Himself and make sure He blasts His enemies because that's what I feel like doing? Is that really what Jesus does in His character? And I get to a passage like 1 Peter 2, verse 21 and following, and I don't know what to do with that. "For to this you were called, disciples. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow in His steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit in His mouth, who when He was reviled, He didn't revile in return, but committed Himself to Him who judges righteously." You know, not everything that's said against a person, particularly a Christian, ought to be responded to. Not every ill that's done in the name of even a religious person, even in the name of Jesus, ought to be responded to. Sometimes, and in fact I would say in the character of Christ, when there's things people say to you and ugliness that they say about you, keeping your mouth shut, committing those things to God, and realizing that God is going to vindicate in His own time. That's a character and that's a quality of being a disciple, because that's a character and quality of Jesus. Who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? God sees He's going to set the record straight. Second thing He says, don't be afraid of the world, because death is not the end. Death is not final. There are 2 ways to know fear. There are 2 ways to know fear. He says, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. There's a fear that's a terror. I don't want to lose my life. I don't want to die. Don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Instead, fear him who's able to destroy both body and soul in hell. There's a fear that comes from particularly an awe and a reverence of God's unlimited power. Death, folks, is inevitable. We can't escape it. There's no way that any of us is going to be able to make it out of this life if Christ doesn't come first without dying first. That's inevitable. However, that's what's also inevitable is we're going to face God in judgment, and He's going to say, "How were you a mirror of my Son, Jesus?" The worst the devil can do is to kill the body, but with God, we depart for something far better. Disciple isn't afraid of the world. God sees He's going to set the record straight, but God providentially cares for you. His eye is on the sparrow. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin for a penny, I think Xander's version said. Here's this little bird that's by all intents worthless, worth half a penny. And Jesus says, there's not one of them falls to the ground without your Father's knowledge. In fact, he'd go on to say, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Sometimes that's a little easier for some of us than it is for others to count them. But Jesus says, if God providentially cares and knows all of those things, even to the very hairs of your head, don't you know He cares about you? In the times that I look at and I see the times when Jesus' disciples in the Bible were afraid, were lonely, were fearful, you're always going to find a God who is there providentially caring for them. The boat on Galilee, Jesus arises and stands before the storm and says, "Peace be still." When you hear about Peter and John's arrest, the disciples are there praying for them. When you read about Stephen's martyrdom and Stephen looks up into heaven, he sees the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. He knows Jesus is upset about this. When you find Paul alone in 2 Timothy chapter 4 having to stand before Caesar at his first defense, and he says, "There was nobody that stood with me, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me." The book of Revelation, written to fearful disciples who possibly wanted to give up and wanted to hide their discipleship for a lesser persecution. You see God offering revelation as an encouragement, a shot in the arm to these people, because He providentially cares. Hallmark number 3, a disciple clearly shows his loyalty. Your eternity depends upon what you do with Jesus. It depends on how well you know, who are you, Lord, and what would you have me to do? Your attitude and relationship with Him right now. And there's 2 options that Jesus says. You can confess me. What does that mean? That means agree with. That means affirm. That means to not be ashamed. That means to stand with and to say, I'm going to stay with Him, come what may. I don't care what the world's going to do to me because I'm not afraid of the world, but instead I'm going to stand where Jesus stands. Amen. The other option, to deny Him. To deny Him. I can deny Him by my silence, by not standing up where I ought to. I can deny Him by my attitude, by the way that I treat the things that Jesus says are important. I can deny Him by absolutely words or deeds. You remember one of the things that Peter did when he's standing outside while Jesus is on trial? Peter began to curse and he began to swear to show that he was not a disciple of Jesus. I said, "You're also with Him. You are one of Him." Peter began to use words that are unbecoming a Christian. He used attitudes that were unbecoming a Christian. We know what it means to show our loyalty. Do we show our loyalty to Jesus? You know, Cardinals baseball season is here again. Had their opener, had a great opener there on Thursday evening from what I understand. How do you know a true fan of Cardinals baseball? How do you know a true fan of any sport or anything? Cardinals baseball, you're going to find people that, and these are hallmarks of fan according to the internet, people that watch the entire game on TV. You can watch an entire game on football or on baseball, more power to you, entire game. They're going to be a little bit superstitious. They're going to wear the same hat and wear the same jersey and do the same things that cause what they think cause what's going on in the game. They know how to record the stats, the ERAs, the OBPs, all those words and those acronyms. They know those. They recognize players by their walk-up music. They follow their social media. They're true fans that are still fans even when the season and even when the team is in the tank. There's a difference between being a fan of Jesus and being a follower of Jesus. There's a difference between being a fan and being loyal to Jesus in terms of Him, because we're not sitting in the stands simply observing Him. In fact, what Jesus says is, my disciples, y'all are in the game. You're following my lead. You're following my character and my example. You're on the field. Christianity is not a spectator sport. We cannot expect that we're going to simply be good followers of Jesus, disciples of Jesus, and be absent from the life that He's called us to live. Hallmark number 4. A disciple regards the Lord more than family. People want Jesus to bring peace. And there is always a desire for Jesus to bring peace in our lives. And yes, He is going to bring peace. That is an inner peace. He's going to look at us and He's going to cause the peace of God to rule in our hearts, to which we're called, and also be thankful. Jesus knows that if we put His practice into life, and if we put His discipleship into life, into practice in our lives, we're going to have an inner peace, come what may. But what Jesus tells us is that He brings us peace not by eliminating trouble and difficulty, but He's able to bring us peace in spite of trouble and difficulty. Parents, sometimes we want for our kids that they won't face any kind of problems in their lives. In fact, we want to steamroll everything in front of our kids so that they never face any kind of trouble or never face any kind of hurt or anything where they might be tempted to be hurt. And we want to steamroll those things, and we want to clear a path for our kids. But folks, we're not good parents if we do that, because we never let our kids struggle with something. We never let them look at something and say, how am I going to face this? And if we never give them instruction to be able to say, in this difficulty, this is what Jesus calls us to do. This is the way that He wants us to respond, to love our enemies, to do good to those who despitefully use us and persecute us. To those who want to slap us on the right cheek, you offer the left cheek. Jesus doesn't take away the trouble and difficulty we face, because Jesus and the world are always going to be at odds. It doesn't give us the right to be ugly and offensive. When we talk about our families, Jesus says here in this passage, verses 34 to 36, don't think I came to bring peace on the earth. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. For I've come to set a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son and daughter more than me is not worthy of me. What do we do when family relationships, those closest relationships we have on this earth, cause us to look at Jesus and say, I don't know, Jesus, if I'm really going to be your disciple or not. When you think about discipleship, it's about realizing what Jesus offers and the family that Jesus offers in the people of God, and changing our minds and our hearts with regard to those things. Hallmark number 5. A disciple's willingly going to offer his own life. He who does not take up his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. And then he would go on to say, verse 38, verse 39, he who finds his life will lose it. He who loses his life for my sake will find it. The emphasis in this passage is not doom and gloom. It's not doom and gloom. Instead, what you're looking at is an emphasis and a commitment to the eternal. There are a number of things that Jesus says by logic that's going to cause us to look at this passage and say, hang on, what is it that I really gain if I really lose? What Jesus is talking about is this. If all we're going to do in this life is seek safety and security, we're going to lose it all. Well, Andy, I got to fix my 401k. I've got to continue working and adding all this money. Listen, you can die with a pile of money and you're going to leave it all here. You can't take it with you. If all you're doing is trying to provide financial or social or emotional security here in this life, Jesus says you're going to lose it all. On the opposite, if you're seeking safety and security in Him, come what may, Stock market may tank tomorrow. Gas prices may continue to go through the roof. Doesn't matter. My safety, my security is in Jesus. Come what may, we gain it all. Who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? What Jesus is saying in this passage and what he's talking about is that there is nothing in this world that's a good trade for your soul. If you take your soul and you trade it for something this world has to offer, even if it's the entire world, Jesus would say in Mark chapter 8, if you trade it all, trade your soul for it all, you've lost it all. You have not made a good trade. What's your relationship with the world? Because the disciple's going to give up his life in order to gain Jesus. Last one. A disciple's going to receive his reward. A disciple's going to receive his reward. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. There is an argument in this set of verses from the greatest to the least. If we receive Jesus, who are we ultimately receiving? The one who sent Jesus. We're receiving God. Jesus would say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. If we receive the one who's sent, we receive the one who's the sender. And then he's going to use an example or argument to say, if you receive a prophet, you're going to receive a prophet's reward. I don't know too many prophets. Well, what about a righteous man? You receive a righteous man, you're going to receive a righteous man's reward. On the least of the spectrum, you give one of these little ones a cup of cold water as a disciple. The smallest deed to the smallest person that you can possibly do. And Jesus says you will by no means lose your reward. You're going to receive a disciple's reward. What I appreciate about this is that God sees everything. God knows everything. I am in awe of those people that can be caregivers to somebody who is either bedridden, to somebody who maybe doesn't have anybody else to care for them, and somebody that can sit beside the bed of a person who's been ill for months or even years and do the meanest of activities for that person because they can't do it for themselves. And you think, where's their discipleship? It's right there. It's them being faithful to that person and doing what they can for that person. And what I understand from this passage is you will by no means lose your reward, that God sees even the things that we take for granted are happening, and even the things that we can't see, and even the things we don't appreciate that are happening. You do these little bitty acts of goodness because you follow Jesus, because you know Him and you want to please Him. Jesus says you will by no means lose your reward. The Lord sees even the smallest actions. They don't go unnoticed. He sees. He doesn't call us to do anything great, but by every single day decisions, by choosing to say, I want to follow Jesus in character, and yes, I want to follow Him in word. I want to glorify Him, so therefore I'm going to fill in the blank. Do we really follow Jesus? Do we really know Him? The Lord sees and rewards even the smallest actions. He sees and He will bless. There was a famous person who had sat through a class in college, and one of the fellow professors, after this person gained gained his fame and his fortune, they went back to this professor and they said, hey, he was in your class, wasn't he? He was one of your students. What was he like as a student? What character did you see that there were elements of greatness because he was there in your class? The teacher dropped his head and he thought for a minute. He said, yes, he attended my classes, but he was never my student. He attended my classes, but he was never my student. I wonder if Jesus sometimes feels that about us. That we attended all the classes, we knew all the books, we knew all the teachings, but we were never really His students. Jesus has this phrase for the people like that. I never knew you. People that never knew Jesus, Jesus says, I never knew you. The two questions that we want to ask as disciples: who are you, Lord? What would you have me to do? Do you know Him this morning? Are you His disciple? Are you His follower? Are you His pupil? Are you His understudy? Are you committed in life to bearing His character and bearing His name? And yes, wanting to follow His actions, wanting to follow His teachings, and wanting to know Christ and the power of His rising, share in His suffering, and be conformed to His death, if by any means we may obtain the resurrection of the dead.